Hello, welcome once again to another episode of History Now. On today's show, joining me from Texas is Chris Tomlinson. Chris is one of the co-authors of a new book which has generated much controversy in his home state of Texas and has been banned from the Texas State History Museum. The book is called Forget The Alamo and has just peaked on the New York Times bestsellers list. So I'm delighted to welcome Chris to the show today. Chris, you're very welcome. To begin with, people, of a certain generation, my age and older, will probably be very familiar with the Alamo, but for people who are probably not initiated, could you tell us what the Alamo is and the historical context of it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the structure that we call the Alamo is actually a Spanish mission built in 1719 by Native American people who had converted to Catholicism. For most of its history, it's been rather abandoned, mostly because the Spanish priests messed up the roof, and the roof of the chapel collapsed very early on. At different points, it's been used as a military garrison, both by the Spanish army, the Mexican army, and eventually it became a centerpiece of a battle when Americans of Anglo descent decided to rebel against the Mexican government and establish Texas independence. The battle is often, remembered because of the logo, Remember the Alamo, because it was a massacre where, guess I really shouldn't say massacre. It was a horrible defeat for 200 Anglo Texans who were fighting against the Mexican army that totaled about 3,000 men. They never intended to have this fight, but they fought to the death. And later on, a few weeks after the battle, there was another battle between the Mexican army and these Anglo rebels. And the battle cry was, "Remember the Alamo, remember the dead at the Alamo." It came into global attention through a Walt Disney miniseries, and that was later cobbled together to make a movie called Davy Crockett and the Wild Frontier. In the 1950s, in the early days of television, this TV series took off. Everyone around the world started wearing coonskin caps like Davy Crockett. And then John Wayne followed it up with a movie called The Alamo in 1960. And between those two things, it has become a cultural touchstone.
Your book, you break it up into, focusing on the actual battle, but then, the rise of the myth in American culture. And I want to go back to that. But what made you think, you and your co-authors, that, this thing needs reevaluating? We need to, look back and see what the actual story was.
Well, Texans are a prideful people. And the fact that we once were our own country and that Texas had its own battle for independence from a foreign power, in this case Mexico, meant that we had our own origin myth. And the Battle of the Alamo is an important part of that origin myth. And when the state was majority Anglo, when white supremacy was the dominant politics, people created this myth of brave Anglo fighters defending liberty against swarthy, dark-skinned Mexican oppressors. And that myth was perpetuated for a lot of reasons, which we'll talk about, but Texas is changing. Only 41% of Texas's population is Anglo today. By 2025, the majority of Texans will be Hispanic, most of them of Mexican descent. So we have to reevaluate these myths. Additionally, the Alamo is kind of in sad shape. It's not a very pleasant place to visit. It hasn't been updated since the mid-'60s. And so local officials want to revitalize the Alamo. And part of that was convincing the rock singer Phil Collins to donate his collection to be the foundation for a new museum. And so Texans were talking about spending $450 million renovating Alamo Plaza at a time in which Anglos are the minority in Texas. And so we had to ask, can this origin myth be sustained, or is it time to reconsider it?
I've watched previous interviews that you've given, and you've been very forthright in saying that this is something that people within universities, within historical research, have been talking about for a number of years. What does that tell us about how seriously, that historical research is taken with the public, not just in America, but around the world in many places?
Well, Texas has an elected school board, and that elected state board of education is majority conservative. We have a very difficult time teaching evolution here, let alone a proper view of history. And so that's a major part of the last third of our book. The first third is the lead up to the battle itself. The second part is the creation of the myth. And the third part is this battle between professional historians who know the truth, but can't get it out there because we have this conservative, reactionary, traditionalist political elite that is controlling Texas and preventing that true story from reaching our children. So I would like to think that that other places that don't politicize education as much as we do may have been able to get the word out, that professional historians may have had more success. But, this is a state where just last year a historian was fired from her job at a state university because she would not toe the line on traditionalist history. And that's a sad state of affairs, and another thing we wanted to highlight in the book.
Given what you've just said about the person being fired, the Conservative Education Board, were you prepared for a backlash, the backlash that you and your co-authors have faced?
Well, as you said, we weren't really reporting anything prior to 2019 that had not already been written and reported by someone else. As early as 1986, a guy named Jeff Long wrote a book called Duel of Eagles that took a very dismal view of the Texas revolutionaries. He had armed men picketing his house. Walter Bunger, the chair of the history department at the University of Texas, said that slavery was an important factor in the Texas Revolution, and he started receiving death threats. And that was 2 years ago, because I've spoken to Walter about this. So we know that there are people out there who want to silence the truth. What I was not expecting was an elected official such as our lieutenant governor to use his authority to prevent us from speaking. And that's a violation of our First Amendment rights, and obviously we've begun legal proceedings as a result. But it just shows the boldness of these traditional conservatives, that they feel empowered to silence people. And that's a much bigger issue than what really happened at the Alamo.
Can I bring it back just to, the 1836 itself and the battle? There are a couple of important things that you address in the book, and that is particularly around slaveholding rights. Now that contrasts very sharply with what you've been talking about is the origin myth. Can we talk about what you address in the book in relation to what these men were fighting for?
Yes, so we drew profoundly on a book called Seeds of Empire by Andrew Torgett, who is a professor at the University of North Texas. And he was looking at the economics of Texas between 1820 up until 1850, which, covers both sides of the Texas Revolt in 1835 and 1836. And he determined, and he very effectively demonstrated, that the Anglo economy in Texas depended almost solely on growing cotton. And growing cotton depended solely on slavery. and that there was no way these Anglo settlements in Texas would have thrived or even survived without slavery. We take a look at, the political side of that, where we have the founder of these Anglo colonies, Stephen F. Austin, making multiple trips to Mexico City and to the provincial capital and fighting to get Texas excluded from Mexico's abolition laws. Because Mexico, after it won its independence in 1821, was a multicultural, multiracial society. They were anti-colonial and they were anti-slavery. Texas, Ecohia, which was what the province was called at the time, was the only place to allow slavery. And it was only allowed for a few years, and then the slaves would have to be released, or they would have to become indentured servants. There was this back and forth and many different laws passed, but it was quite clear that the main tension between the Anglo settlers and the Mexican government was the question of slavery. And so we make that point, that while, yes, you can say that the Mexican government's attempt to arrest William B. Travis was the trigger for the revolution, we make the argument, there were the underlying cause. The primary underlying dispute was slavery. And that's something that traditionalists are really angry about. And that is really the chief complaint from our critics.
Coming from an Irish history background, I'm very aware of, the cult of personality in terms of historical figures. There are a few historical figures there, one you've just mentioned, William B. Travis, Davy Crockett as well. You also have Jim Bowie. These are people who are not only household names in Texas, but they're household names throughout the United States and beyond. Can you tell us about what you've uncovered or what you bring to your argument in relation to those people?
Well, there's a great book called Three Roads to the Alamo, which covers the personal histories of these three, who we call the Holy Trinity of the Texas origin myth. We have Jim Bowie, who is the father figure, the older, rougher, stern leader, a slave smuggler, slave trader, a land thief, a con man, a knife fighter, someone who, if he'd remained in the United States, probably would have been hung for his crimes, and that's why he came to Texas. Then we have, the son, William Travis, who's 20 years younger. He came at 24. He died at the age of 26. Got a girl pregnant when he was a teenager, married her, abandoned her, killed a man he thought was her lover, fled Alabama, leaving her and his son behind, takes a stolen slave with him to Texas, and tries to get a new start. And he becomes he's the rabble rouser. He's the one that's out in the streets trying to raise the forces to fight the Mexican government. Davy Crockett comes last, and he's kind of like the Holy Spirit. He's 49 years old. He's had a failed political career. His life is a mess. He's being mocked on Broadway and in all these ridiculous novels about his life. And so he's coming to Texas for a new start, hoping to begin a new political career, and ends up at the Alamo. And these three men come together, and each one of them, of course, has this horrible background. These are not people of character. And the argument goes that the crucible of the Alamo changed that. And we make the argument, no, not really.
Shining a light on the character of these people, has proved controversial. But there's another aspect of, the controversy I want to address now. And this is that you say the Alamo's trapped offenders died pretty much for nothing. Can you tell us why you drew those conclusions and why that has proved so controversial?
It really became a question of psychological warfare. And when seen in that context, you begin to understand what really happened. Travis was at the Alamo. He was a political rival of Sam Houston. He was trying to become the next president or the first president of the Texas Republic. So he's writing all these glorious letters. Jim Bowie was a drunk like Houston. They understood each other. Houston sends Bowie down to San Antonio and says, blow up the fort, grab the men, and bring those men back to me because I have virtually no army, and I can't waste any troops on a dusty town called San Antonio that's majority Mexican anyway, and there's no cotton land down there. We want to draw the line at the Colorado River. But Jim Bowie gets down there, and it's where his wife died. It's where his in-laws died of cholera just a few years before. He's also a drunk and has problems controlling his temper. We see that in the reports prior to the Mexicans' arrival. And so they're basically partying, getting drunk. Travis is going increasingly more hyperbolic with his political attempts. And they both choose to ignore Juan Seguin, a third-generation San Antonian, a Tejano, a Mexican, who has his own cavalry. He's the former mayor of San Antonio. And his scouts keep coming back and saying, the Mexican army is on the way. We got to get out of here, or we've got to improve the defenses, one or the other. And Travis and Bowie ignore him until a white man looking through a telescope sees lances glistening in the sun of an approaching cavalry. And by that time, it's too late. They can't flee. They can't reinforce the fortress. And so they retreat inside the Alamo, and they are trapped. They are not ordered to fight. No one expects them to fight. The expectation was that they would leave. But once the Mexican cavalry surrounds the fortress, Santa Anna gives his order saying, I expect unconditional surrender, or we're going to attack, then it's too late. The battle does not slow down Santa Anna's advance. In fact, he attacks the Alamo and cleans up the city before his next division arrives, which he was waiting for before he was going to move on anyway. So really, there was no strategic value. There was no delay in the advance. And in fact, the men who fought were disobeying orders. So that's our argument for why it was a mistake. Now, Sam Houston, on the other hand, he needed to twist that. He needed to spin this loss somehow. As soon as word got out the Alamo had fallen, all these Anglos started packing up and fleeing Texas. They were all heading back to the United States. His army was deserting him. So he needed to turn this around somehow. And so he, within 72 hours of finding out that the Alamo has fallen, he is calling it the Thermopylae of Texas. He's saying these are Spartans who fought to defend us. We have an obligation to come together and take advantage of the time that they bought us. But this was the origin of the Alamo myth, is this Sam Houston's need to have a political explanation for why he never sent reinforcements despite all of Travis's letters, and also why Travis and Bowie disregarded his orders. And it's a story that has stuck with us, even though it has no basis in fact.
As you've drawn attention to earlier in the interview, the television program, the movie with John Wayne, there was even records released, songs released about Davy Crockett, I know of those. You address that in the book, but also I want to go back to Phil Collins, because there are two, really famous rock stars who feature in that. One's Ozzy Osbourne. I think that was the first time I had ever heard of the Alamo, when Ozzy Osbourne, drunk as he was arrested at it. But Phil Collins is a much more interesting story. Can you tell us about his collection and what that means for the upkeep of that myth?
Phil Collins was one of those kids in London who saw the Walt Disney movie about Davy Crockett. He's talked about this in interviews. He was 5 or 6 years old. The idea of these valiant men sacrificing their lives so others may live, appealed to him. Later, when he becomes wealthy, his wife buys him a letter that was written at the Alamo. And he says, I had no idea I could collect artifacts. And so it begins. And in the beginning, we have, thanks to him donating his collection to the state, I have been able to get a copy of his receipt book. It's 4 volumes of receipts and documents with provenance and authentication of his collection. And it starts out, buying from Beverly Hills dealers who verified these letters, these minor bits and bobs that had 100% quality authentication and provenance. But then he comes back to the Alamo in 2004 and he meets a couple of local antiques dealers and says to them, I'll buy anything. I'm retiring from music. I'm interested in expanding my collection. I'll buy anything related to it. Give me a call when you come across something. And as one expert says in our book, this was like a bird's nest on the ground for unscrupulous antiques dealers. And next thing you know, they're selling him Jim Bowie's personal knife that he died holding in his hand at the Alamo. That they are selling Jim Bowie's saber that he used to fight at the Alamo. William B. Travis's sword belt, Davy Crockett's shot pouch. These incredible, amazing artifacts that, everyone assumed were lost to history. Well, turns out that when you dig into that provenance, it's really, really weak. And we have experts who say that not only is the provenance weak, the items are almost assuredly falsified. They're fake. We go deep into this in the book to explain all of this. And it turns out that the state of Texas, this one politician was so excited to get Collins's collection that he didn't question it and made a commitment that the state of Texas would spend tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to build a museum for these artifacts without checking to see if they were real. And so that was the big news that we broke in the book, was that the marquee items, the most important items in the Collins collection, the best thing we can say about them is that the provenance is almost non-existent.
I'm going to bring it up to just maybe 4 weeks ago. You're due to speak, you and your co-authors due to speak at the Bullock, Texas State History Museum to publicise the book. A couple of hours before it was due to take place, the rug was pulled out from underneath you and it was cancelled. Were you expecting anything like that to happen, as dramatic as that, at that sort of late hour? And what was the reaction of you and your co-authors?
We had been invited to speak by the Bullock Texas State History Museum is its full name. It is the Texas State official government-owned and operated museum for Texas history. We had been invited back in March. They had anticipated our book for some time. They were excited to have us. They understood that it was controversial. And they had had controversial authors and books presented at the museum in the past. So they didn't see any problem. And we thought, it's not a big deal. We'll get a few hundred people on Zoom and it'll be fun. But then the Texas Public Policy Foundation, they caught wind of our book and decided to start comparing it to the New York Times 1619 project, which examines the role of slavery and the importance of slavery to Texas history. And nationally, the 1619 project is a lightning rod for conservative condemnation of racial awareness and of attempts to address racism in our culture. Well, TPPF considered us to be the Texas equivalent of the 1619 project and decided to turn us into a source of outrage for their supporters. They started lobbying the governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker of the state House of Representatives to ban us at the Bullock. The day before the talk, the Bullock executive director said, "No problem, we're on, we're going to do it." The conversation was going to be moderated by the Writers League of Texas. I was driving from Houston to Austin, and I get a phone call about 3.5 hours before we're supposed to go on. And the moderator had contacted us and said the Bullock had told her that the event was canceled. Now, the Writers League offered to do it on their Zoom channel, but we were going to lose the 300 people who had signed up to hear us speak at the Bullock. We decided we needed to kind of figure out what was going on. So we postponed the event. I went on Twitter saying we've been banned at the Bullock, and the Bullock owes us an explanation because this is the government violating our First Amendment rights by silencing us for an event for no good reason, no due process, no explanation. The next morning, the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, gets on Twitter and says, "I canceled it because I don't want that book discussed at the Texas State History Museum," which is basically an admission that he was violating our First Amendment rights. We have since had attorneys contact the Bullock, contact the Lieutenant Governor, demanding that they restore our event exactly the way it was planned before. We've not had no response, and so we're now considering a federal lawsuit. But it became clear at that moment that we were going to be a pawn in the culture wars. It was no longer about whether our book was correct or incorrect. It wasn't about our thesis. It was about being able to say, hey, these three woke authors, as one commentator put it, are trying to ruin Texas history. So we'll see. As I say, my experience has been that they call it the Barbra Streisand effect. When you try to tell people not to see something or not to read something, they become more interested in it. Our book was in the mid 100s sales rank, which is very respectable on Amazon. We shot up to number 17. We were just off the New York Times bestseller list before. We went up to number 10 the week after this happened. We literally sold out of books, had to go to a third printing, and just 2 days ago, books finally got back in stock. So, the public has voted with their dollars. My experience is that, the only people who are really surprised by our book are those over 60. People under 40 are like, yeah, of course the Texas Revolution was about slavery. Of course these people were white supremacists who did not want to be ruled by Mexicans. Why is this an issue? Why are we surprised by this? So, I like to say it's part of Texans are going to age out of this.
Well, that explains why my book took so long in getting here. The fact that so many people bought it. Chris, it's not only is it a fantastic look at an origin myth, it's a fantastic case study for our times, I think. With what you've explained there about, being banned from the Bullock Museum and lots of things about free speech, but also the way history is taught and the way history is received. So congratulations on all of that. It's certainly made an impact, of course, in America, but there's a lot of talk about it over this side of the Atlantic too, which I'm sure you're happy with.
Oh yeah, no, maybe we'll get a British publisher out of it. Fingers crossed.
Chris, thanks very much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Barry. It's been great.